Hello, AP Worlders. This is Empires in Collision during the Revolutions era. Some countries were able to confront an aggressive and industrializing West while maintaining its formal independence, so they weren't imperialized by the West. These places include China, Japan, well, what was the Ottoman Empire, which was this area. Today it's like Turkey. Persia, which is here, and Ethiopia, which is here, and the Latin American countries that we previously learned about. Other areas in Africa and Asia and Oceania are going to be imperialized, which we'll talk more about next time. Today we are going to focus on three of the countries that were able to maintain their independence to different degrees from industrialized Europe. We're going to focus on China, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. They all needed to deal with the four dimensions of the European moment. First was the military might of Europe. How are they going to deal with Europe's military might since they were industrialized? Second, how to be able to deal with the trade, investment, and migration. How to also deal with Europe's culture. And then fourth, how are they going to deal with becoming modern? All right, such things as women's rights, nationalism, socialism, individuality, which went against their traditional societies. So those are the big four things that they had to deal with. First, we're going to deal with China. China is going to go through a reversal of fortune. All right, before this, China was the top dog, but now that they didn't industrialize, they're going to realize during this era how far they fell behind. China was a victim of their early success. Its huge economy and population growth are going to be hurt because they don't industrialize. Their agricultural production can't keep up with their population growth. China's large population, they didn't have enough food or jobs to satisfy the people. They also didn't expand their government, so they couldn't keep up with tax collection or social welfare for the people or security for the people. This is going to lead to what was known as the Taiping Uprising. The leaders didn't want to restore an old Chinese society. They didn't want to go back to Confucian ways. They wanted a revolutionary change. They did gain some success, however, division and indecisiveness within the group, as well as military support for the Qing dynasty from the West, enabled the Qing dynasty to regain control and crush the rebellion. However, the dynasty is going to be very weak, and now that they're weak from internal problems, they're going to get pressure from the West. All right, so remember one thing that we said as a theme: first the country gets internal problems, and then they get external problems. So China's going to get external problems from the West. Britain started trading opium that they produced in their colony of India to trade with China. They needed something to trade with China, and this is going to reverse the trade imbalance that they had with China. Now China is going to import a huge amount of opium. The Chinese government's going to realize that they have two big problems here. First, the trade deficit being a problem. Now it was a massive outflow of silver. All right, remember before this, China was collecting a lot of silver. Silver was flowing in, but now it was flowing out. Second, there were millions of Chinese who were addicted to this opium. So China's emperor is going to decide to get rid of the opium, and it's going to be led by Lin Zhu, who's going to lead this fight against them. And he's going to seize some of these ships here, some of the British ships, and destroy huge numbers of British opiums. And this is going to greatly anger the British, and it's going to lead to the First Opium War. But the British industrialized army would win decisively and force the Chinese to open more ports and have more trade. The biggest thing that this defeat in the Opium Wars proved was how far China had fallen behind. The Second Opium War would force China to open up even more ports and allow foreigners to freely move around the country. Foreigners started to carve out spheres of influence. Here's a political cartoon showing the people carving into China, different spheres of influence. Spheres of influence are a country or area where another country has power to affect their developments, but no formal authority. So they don't formally have control of their government, but they influence them to make decisions. I'm not sure if I put that on your Cornell sheet. If I didn't, make sure you put down what spheres of influence mean. The once powerful and proud China have been reduced and had to accept the fact that they are no longer the center of civilization. China did attempt to reform. They tried to self-strengthen themselves. Many conservative leaders were against it, though. They didn't want to lose their power and privileges. This would lead to one of these biggest movements, which was the Boxer Uprising. That was one of the biggest anti-foreign movements in China. They killed numerous Europeans and Chinese Christians. They wanted to get rid of all Western influence in China. But the Western powers, once again, helped the Qing to crush the rebellion and impose a huge payment of a fine on China as a punishment. The second group we'll look at is the Ottoman Empire. Like China, the Islamic world felt little need to learn from the West prior to this era. But neither China or the Ottomans are going to be able to create an industrial economy or a strong enough state that was needed to fend off Europeans' intrusions. For China, it would eventually lead to them turning into a communist state, and for the Ottoman Empire, it would eventually lead to them being dissolved and broken into different nations after World War I. The Ottoman Empire soon started to fall behind the rest of Europe. Alright, so here you can see in the early years of the Ottoman Empire, you can see how strong they were, how they reached into Eastern Europe and controlled all that land. However, by this era, by the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was falling behind the rest of Europe. They became known as the sick man of Europe. Their land was starting to shrink. Napoleon, well, first they lost this land, Northern Africa, but then Napoleon's going to come and take over Egypt. Alright, it was important for Napoleon to get Egypt because he was trying to get a route to the Indian Ocean faster. So Napoleon's going to take over Egypt, and then this area, the Balkans, right, which is Greece, and like Serbia and other countries, they are going to also fight for their independence and break free. So the Ottoman Empire was starting to shrink. The leaders of the Ottoman realized they were falling behind and tried a defensive modernization program. They attempted to reorganize a modernization program. It was called the Tanzimat reforms. And some of the reforms they did was try to update the army and create an elite military group known as the Janissaries, which you can see here. They also led to factories and modern mining operations, telegraphs, steamships, railroads, and postal service, and new westernized law codes and new schools. The Young Turks are going to lead this movement. Alright, so before the Young Turks, they were actually known as the Young Ottomans. And they were people who received a modern, Western-style education and came back to the Ottoman Empire and wanted to reform their political system. They embraced Western technology and science while rejecting Western materialism. The Young Ottomans would eventually, like I said, turn into the Young Turks. And the Young Turks would lead a military coup in 1908. But after World War I, the Ottoman Empire would be completely dissolved. The last group we're going to look at is Japan. Japan, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry, which is seen here, came to Japan in 1853 and forcefully demanded that Japan open up to a more normal relations with the world. 1. Japan was able to turn itself into a powerful, modern, united, industrialized nation, an achievement that neither China nor the Ottoman Empire was able to duplicate. And second, Japan would even become its own imperialist country. So China and Ottoman Empire were not able to industrialize and become powerful. But Japan is. Japan would even become, oh, I'm sorry, I already read that part. But Japan and Russia are going to be the only two areas outside of the West that are going to be able to industrialize during this era. Because when I say the West, I'm lumping the United States in there with them. Because the United States was also able to westernize. Prior to Perry's arrival, Japan was governed by the Tokugawa family. Remember, they had the Tokugawa shogunate, who is going to unite Japan. And they're going to have centuries of peace. So remember, before the Tokugawa shogunate, they were feudalist society, but he united them during this early modern era. But the centuries of peace that Japan had contributed to a burst of economic growth as well as urban development. And those changes during that era are going to provide a solid foundation for Japan to industrialize. Japan had purposefully limited their contact with the West during our previous era. Remember, Japan, after becoming unified with the help of the West, they would kick the West out because of the missionaries. And they only allowed the Dutch to come trade, but only in one port. After Commodore Perry came, they avoided war by agreeing to open up more places to trade. There were unequal trade treaties, but they didn't want to go to war. But that changed, but then Japan would go through a brief civil war in what was called the Meiji Restoration. Now, Japan could modernize, but first they had to have a true, genuine unity within Japan. They would also have political and social changes, and they became obsessed with everything Western. So you can see here, these are Japanese generals, and they look almost like European generals with the way they were dressed, because they became completely obsessed with the West, including education, clothing, and even hairstyles. The biggest success of Japan's defensive modernization that they went through was their state-guided industrialization program. They created a modern infrastructure by building railroads, a postal system, a national currency, and a banking system. Japan industrialized around a number of large firms that were called zaibatsus, Z-A-I-B-A-T-S-U. Most impressively is that Japan did this with their own resources and without massive foreign debt. Japan and Russia were the only two areas outside the West who were able to industrialize during this era. Alright, so that's everything for this lecture. I'll see you guys in class.